I remember, what's the name of that guy? He's the journalist guy. His thing is he's always mad. He's a big dude. He's got a British accent. He's got a hard on for me. He's got a hard on for me.
Loot boxes. We all know them, we've all heard of them, I talk about them often enough, but they are still pervasive, they are still a hot button issue. That was me pressing a button there, you can't see it, it's imaginary, and loot boxes are still finding surreptitious ways to get themselves into the pop culture, right? Like this bullshit right here. PlayStation loot box? What's this doing in Target for $30? Let's have a look at what's in this shit. It's a bunch of trash. The loot box debate can get pretty brutal, especially when developers and publishers want to defend their existence, and it's not hard to see why. Microtransactions that utilise gambling mechanics have been responsible for massive, basically unsustainable growth in the video game industry. A dizzying amount of money in the billions and billions. For a while, Activision Blizzard has been making over $4 billion in microtransaction revenue alone, thanks in no small part to its continued use of loot boxes in Overwatch and Call of Duty, so it's a gravy train few beneficiaries in the game industry want to see go away. According to Ubisoft, loot boxes have been a major boon for the game industry, and while many AAA publishers are being fucking careful now about how they monetize randomization, it does seem loot boxes aren't going away in full anytime soon. But loot boxes are despised by a vocal contingent for their psychologically manipulative, downright predatory implementation. How they use the sunk cost fallacy to keep people spending, how they appeal to and make money from problem gamblers in ways that have been demonstrable and highlighted by gambling commissions across the world. It's no secret by now that yours truly utterly hates loot boxes for these reasons and more. They're an exploitative polyp dangling from the milky anus of the AAA game industry, and if they were to be scrubbed from the game industry overnight, I wouldn't shed a single goddamn tear. Why do I talk about loot boxes so much on this show? Because fuck 'em. That's why. Following investigations, a number of countries, including Belgium and the Netherlands, have outright stated loot boxes are gambling and have restricted their sale accordingly. Meanwhile, Australia, the UK, and even the US are continuing to look at in-game gambling to see if it's as serious and as in need of regulation as traditional betting avenues. David Jaffe, known exclusively for his hit shooter Drawn to Death, takes umbrage with arguments against loot boxes, specifically when it comes to the question of whether or not they should be regulated. Over the past few months, he's been specifically going off on one about the situation, boiling down arguments in favour of regulation as people wanting to censor things they don't like. In one tweet, the Jaffe Meister compares loot boxes to cliffhangers in The Walking Dead, comparing the narrative manipulation of an episodic TV show to the financial manipulation of gambling, which is just wrong? Like a basically and fundamentally wrong comparison? You can't equate the two. You can't equate a cliffhanger in a narrative to gambling. But Jaffe's comparison does highlight a key issue and a thing defenders of loot boxes frequently get wrong. They keep thinking regulation of loot boxes is a censorship of art, and have confused a business tactic with an artistic expression. Jaffe is not the only one. A GDC roundtable last year specifically called loot box regulation in Belgium a form of censorship, roping it in with the World Health Organization's recognition of gaming disorder and the banning of augmented reality in military bases, neither of which are really examples of censorship either. In fact, the only pertinent example is China also banning augmented reality. What are developers to do? The roundtable summary asks. What are developers to do? Aside from not taking advantage of players to get more money out of them after they already bought your game, you mean? What are we to do? Before we continue, I need to restate once again that I've never inherently been in favour of government regulation of video games, not even for loot boxes. I would always rather see the industry mow its own backyard and regulate itself, or at least display a modicum of restraint. I have not called for government regulation of loot boxes, but I did see it coming, and I did warn the game industry for months about it on this very show, and what I predicted turned out to come true, as it so often does, because for someone who's accused of knowing nothing about the industry, I sure do seem to suss out its future a fucking lot. It's because of this, because the result of AAA publishers' unchecked and rampant greed was always going to get the government interested, that I have stopped caring whether or not said greed gets legislated. Because let's face it, the publishers don't care about tomorrow if they can make all their money today. That's a trait of all big businesses, and it's why regulations even happen. Because a corporation is concerned only with making money, which it'll do at the expense of its employees, its customers, and the environment. It's why unions exist, it's why consumer advocacy exists, and it's why regulations exist. Because companies won't keep themselves in check. What's happening with potential loot box regulation is nothing new, it's simply the expected result of an industry seeing how far it can push the envelope. Eventually, the envelope will get pushed back because people need protection from fucking companies. It's very nice to imagine a cotton candy gumdrop land where businesses don't need regulations and our rivers and oceans are actually pink lemonade, but that's naive. Anyway, back to David Jaffe. And serving champagne at holiday parties is bad for alcoholics, Jeff reductively argues. Gamers don't like loot boxes and will side with anything, even government regulation of fucking art that you claim to care so much about, to make them go away. Pathetic. Right. First of all, Jaffe fails to note that alcohol is already regulated. Like, its sale is specifically restricted in part because of issues like alcoholism. Yes, you can serve alcohol at a party, but not to a room full of kids, and only after you bought it from, presumably, a store specifically cleared to sell that potentially addictive liquid. It's almost as if there are rules to selling it, but that's beside the point. The point here is the belief that regulation of loot boxes is censorship of art. No, it's not. Loot boxes are not artistic expression. Loot boxes are a form of transaction, and transactions are regulated all the fucking time. From delivery policies, to terms and service updates, to sales taxes, every element of a business transaction is subject to some sort of ruling. Yes, even in video games, a medium that for some reason people seem to think has always been some sort of sacred exception. We're talking about monetization here, not expression. Let's break this down, right? Gambling is already legislated. Okay, that's a done deal. Already regulated. There are restrictions on what venues can offer gambling as an activity. Children are not allowed to gamble, often not allowed in venues where there is gambling. It's already regulated. So if it's determined that loot boxes are gambling, as it has been in several countries, it's only logical they'd be subject to the exact same regulations, right? This really ain't fucking complex. If it's found to be gambling, it should be subject to gambling law, not somehow excluded and compartmentalized away from the law for no other reason than video games are special. It wouldn't be art being censored, It'd be gambling being governed by gambling laws. Game publishers, and indeed many game customers, labour under this belief that video games are above the law, that they're a special exception, and that any attempt to legislate their business practices is censorship. Never mind the fact that the game industry has gotten away with not paying dues that many other mediums pay. No, even the slightest modicum of accountability is just too much for the precious eggshell princes of the video game industry. David Jaffe himself calls the pushback against loot boxes gamer entitlement, but what about fucking publisher entitlement? Thinking you're untouchable and getting offended when your gambling mechanics are subject to gambling regulations is the epitome of an entitled goddamn attitude. I am sick to death. I am drawn to death of hearing entitlement applied only to the customer side and never to the industrial side, where self-importance and avarice and near constant abdication of accountability is par for the fucking course. How dare you? Really? How dare you claim it's entitlement for customers to want protection, to want to not be preyed upon by video game publishers? That's entitled? How dare you? Right, back to art. While it's true that the little digital boxes containing random loot can be art and are obviously designed by artists, their purpose is not so much expression as attraction. They're drawn and rendered to be visually enticing, mysterious crates or treasure chests promising obscure rewards within. Now, some loot boxes can be quite beautifully designed, but all of this is also true of slot machines, which are often bright, colourful, and layered with all sorts of dazzling artwork. Slot machines are themselves beautiful and artistic and can be considered art, but hey-ho, guess the fuck what? That doesn't matter when it comes to restrictions. They are regulated regardless, because ultimately they're a means of transaction, and above all, they're fucking gambling, mate. We can make the argument for anything as art, from beer bottles to little pictures on pills, but ultimately things designed to make money, up to and including video games, are subject to certain restrictions pertinent to how that money's made. I couldn't begin to consider the regulation, the potential, regulation of in-game gambling as censorship of art. You want to talk restriction of artwork? Then look no further than loot boxes themselves, whose existence has categorically been observed to negatively affect the fundamental design of several games. Why is Overwatch's reward system so unrewarding when compared to other online shooters? Why is Call of Duty such a stripped-down shell of its former self, stingy with unlocks and lousy with grind? It's by design, giving you just enough to get invested in the rewards in the hopes you'll spend money getting more junk. Why did both Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Shadow of Mordor have to overhaul their entire progression and gear systems once loot boxes were removed? Because the games had been designed around them, and without them, the games were grinding, unrewarding slogs to get through. You want to talk about art? You want to talk about the art you claim to care so much about? Why not talk about how artwork is being mutilated and broken and twisted to agonizingly stretch around business models that are being mandated not by artists, but by executives? We already know, we've already seen how loot boxes and microtransactions in general dramatically alter the entertainment value, hell, the basic quality of any given video game, all because publishers feel entitled to more and more and more and more money. We need to stop assigning so much exterior blame for censorship when the most artistic restriction comes from the fucking publishers themselves. Especially in recent years, we've been looking at the wholesale vandalization of video games, all in a bid on the publisher's part to carve up content, make progression a grind, and introduce pay-to-win elements for profit. And while we're here, they're also the ones dictating what kind of games a studio can even make, regardless of said studio's experience or interests, before closing the studios down if the games they've no business making suck. The art has already been compromised, folks, and it's the sellers of the art that have been defacing it for fucking years. That bit about studio closure has nothing to do with the discussion, by the way. I just brought it up because that's what happens constantly in a big budget industry that really has no respect for art whatsoever and only busts the A word out when it's convenient to hide behind. AAA games are getting worse. Over the last decade, we've been able to witness firsthand how less rewarding games have gotten, how more content has gotten carved out and resold to the customer, how games have been explicitly designed to be less fun on purpose, to contrive a reason to sell time savers and boosters and randomized rewards. The art has been steadily eroded and replaced with sheer capitalistic cynicism. So I don't for a second buy this propaganda that regulating gambling is censoring art. And that's what the argument is, by the way. It's fucking propaganda, and it's predicated on the idea that video game publishers think you're fucking stupid and can't see how they've plundered the artistic expression they're now trying to use as an excuse. This ain't a freedom of speech issue. This ain't a censorship issue. It is what it is, an abusive monetization system facing the potential consequences of its abuse. That's all it is. And the industry could have gotten ahead of all this. It had months, it had years to get ahead of all this, and it didn't fucking bother. This is on the publishers' fucking heads, not on the heads of their prey. The game industry could stand to have some accountability for once in its fucking life.
He's got a hard-on for me.
You know what, Craig? Actually, it's pretty decent build quality on that. It's alright, you could drink hot or cold, really. Right, so, I know that for some of you, you were expecting maybe a Randy Pitchford episode. My old friend, my dear old friend, Randy Pitchford. Now, I didn't do an episode on that because I am still observing the situation, because right now there are a lot of accusations being thrown around, some of them very outlandish, some of them basically, if I were to do a video in my style, it might open me up for another libel lawsuit, and I don't need another one of those. So I am keeping an eye on the situation, and come on, of course I'm going to talk about it at some point. It will be a post-mortem spectacular. A spectacular, mind! But until then, all we know as an actual admitted fact is that Randy Pitchford left a thumb drive of porn at a medieval times alongside company files that were on the same drive. And all I've got to say to that is, get 2 drives. Don't have your company files. And a cam girl who was squirting in a way that suggested to you a magician's trick so that you could learn magic by watching the squirting of the cam girl. Just don't have them on the same drive. You're a CEO of a corporation, mate. You can afford 2. All right? 1 for company files, 1 for squirting ejaculate. How about that? But there will be a spectacular, I already know it's going to be special just from what we've seen. But yeah, there's a nasty lawsuit going on between Randy Pitchford and someone else, a lawyer, if I recall correctly. And right now it's very bitter and we're not sure what is. That's not good, is it? That looks like that belongs on a thumb drive found at a medieval times. I will leave it at that, but I am well aware of the situation. You don't need to email me about it or tell me about it. Get 2 drives. Thank God for me first, and then get 2.
Everybody's thinking about me.
He's got a hard on for me. He's got a hard on for me. He's got a hard on for me. He's got a hard on for me. He's got a hard on for me.